Congratulations to you all. You've stumbled on a pretty good panel today who has a lot of information on these issues at the reasonable price of free of charge. I'm going to go through an overview of what our topics are today and what we'll discuss, and then I will get us going with some dialogue that will hopefully lead to some substantive information. So the first set of for our programming today, first we're going to go over really get to know you a little bit further about our panelists and get to know you type of questions about the topics. Then we'll move into kind of an overview about what are the biggest cybersecurity threats affecting the commercial landscape today, and the who, what, when, where, how, why of ransomware attacks, how they work, what their effects are, and issues that kind of table set for what the next component of the programming will be, which is prevention. We'll talk a little bit about the insurance side of it, to what degree these cybersecurity threats are insurable events, to what degree coverages are available, and best practices for procuring coverages. Then we'll go into principles and required measures for sensible approaches to ransomware prevention or any type of cybercrime prevention. We'll talk a little bit about the staffing and training that should be associated for any corporate composition on preventing these type of events. And then we'll talk about the legal and regulatory framework for cybersecurity duties of prevention that companies need to be aware of. In other words, what kind of legal responsibilities does any company owe with respect to preventing a cybercrime and its intrusion upon the customer base that you may work with. And the last topic grouping that we'll go through in our presentation is surviving and recovering from an attack. So what does an adequate incident response plan look like? What are your sequence of events and actions after an incident? The proverbial to pay or not to pay question, and what the legal obligations that you may have after an attack. Lastly, I think we'll close with some commentary on best practices on how to learn from it and get better in the event that you are attacked. So with that said, I'll get us started with the introductory type of question, really just starting with Doug, and we'll pass it down the line. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your company, and your experience with cybercrime prevention and loss mitigation.
Hi, I'm Doug Lowenthal. Thank you, Charlie. Appreciate that opening. Thanks for everyone for being here today and attending virtually. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, great. So I've been in IT now for 25 years or so. My beard wasn't quite this, or didn't exist when I started, but the managed service company that we handle the day-to-day IT for many local organizations here throughout the Southeast, managing thousands of computers spread across hundreds of locations for our clients, and we're the day-to-day support. And from a strategic perspective, we're having these conversations around security and the technology that they're leveraging. We play more on the defense side, trying to avoid the incident from occurring to begin with, which is what I'll be sharing quite a bit about today, and how to not be in the situation that this happens. Then obviously we have a whole slew of individuals that will guide not if it occurs, but when it occurs, what you can actually do at that point and to mitigate. So happy to share any knowledge that I can today with you all, and look forward to any questions you have. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vicky Zelen of Zelen Risk Solutions, and we help our clients to get cyber liability insurance coverage in place in case they have a situation that happens. And it can be any type of a little add-on to a commercial property and general liability policy with Hartford Insurance Company. A lot of the different insurance companies are offering a little add-on coverage, which is very reasonable and really prudent to take that type of a coverage because it's great and it's reasonable. If you have a true cyber risk, we recommend a standalone cyber policy. And we've been working with our clients. I haven't really had direct, problems with clients so far. I hear about a lot of things that have happened, and we just try to get the applications to the insureds. Even filling out the application, their IT department really has to fill it out because it's so specific about the computers and the firewalls and the technology that they're using, and just try to help them to get the policy that's affordable, that's going to give them the best coverage. And one of the insurance companies we work with, for example, had a situation involving a cyber incident. The president of the insurance company was in a hotel down in Miami, and she was sending out emails. She got onto the hotel's internet connection, and somebody in her office received an email from her asking her to wire $150,000 to a business. And the person in her office replied back on the email and asked a few questions. And when they got the answers back, it didn't sound like the president. They said, "This sounds weird, the way she's phrasing this. It's not the way she normally would talk." So they called the president, and she said, no, she did not send that email whatsoever. The person that sent it had deleted it. So she went and looked in her deleted items, and there it was. It was actually sent from her emails and in her deleted. These kinds of things are happening all the time, and they're saying that about 40% of small businesses at some point are going to have a problem. And if you don't have any kind of security systems in place to prevent it, or some insurance to help you get through it, 60% of the small businesses that have an attack are not going to be around in 6 months. So it's really important, and we're here to help.
CEO of Risk Confidence Group. It is a consultancy and private investigations agency. So as you heard from my background, what I have really done is taken my experiences from my background into the private sector. Basically, I am a problem solver. My group is a problem solver, a group of problem solvers. And, you know, whether it be harassment investigations, personnel issues, business email compromise, frauds, we cover all of those things, basically giving you a clear picture of what the situation and circumstances are so that you can make a good decision.
Oh, my name's Trooper Adam Johnson with the Florida Highway Patrol, Bureau of Criminal Investigations and Intelligence. I'm a task force officer with the Secret Service. Done a bunch of training with the Secret Service. They've got a program for state and local law enforcement, so which consists of multiple week classes covering a range of topics focused on digital forensics to network intrusions, ransomware investigations. One of the things I think is important to understand, I think Doug quickly mentioned it, is that malware and ransomware network intrusion is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when it's going to come to your business ultimately. You know, what you do to mitigate that plays a big part in what actually happens after the fact.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lynne Rhode with Jimerson Birr. Thank you all for being here. I'm privileged to be up here with such an impressive panel. I'm a 16-year regulatory attorney and have practiced primarily in Virginia and Florida with clients in both the public regulator side as well as the private regulated community side. Clients on in both of those categories face and are facing an increasingly robust regulatory and risk environment associated with what we used to simply call data issues or data privacy. Now, very expansive definitions into the general category of cybersecurity. I see a lawyer's role as that of sort of twofold, one as a quarterback and two as a risk advisor at every step of the way, making sure that we coordinate all of the expertise we're going to hear about today so that we can minimize and address risk at each level, both in terms of being proactive on the front end and response at the back end.
Thank you very much. Vicky, you'd shared that war story. It reminded me of an incident that where we had even at our law firm a few months ago, where I think Lynne was one of the first persons to contact me in the morning and ask me if I was feeling generous because someone had spoofed my email and contacted certain employees, asking them to go and buy a bunch of gift cards or things of that nature. So that's just one type of mechanism or schematic that these bad actors and criminals can do to commit some type of cyber crime. And while I was feeling generous that day, it just didn't happen to take that form. So let's see. So I'm going to direct this question to Toni, but the rest of the panel's welcome to chime in as it sees fit. But Toni, what do you see as the biggest cybersecurity threats that are affecting the commercial marketplace right now? You can, yeah.
So I think for me, it is intrusions. Number one, intrusions are a big deal because it's the network intrusion or the communication system intrusion to go in and manipulate the system. Second is insider threats. I think they pose, there's a lot of information out there about it. I don't know how many companies are actually pursuing that, especially with a remote workforce now. The insider threat is real. And then third, I think, is the ransomware, because it can be used in so many different ways to perpetrate so many different cyber threat issues.
Great. Anybody else have anything to add on that?
I could definitely mirror what Toni shared, but I mean, from an IT department's perspective, we're seeing communication intrusions, breach mailboxes, things of that sort, where they're getting in, kind of mining the information to figure out, how to get access to financials, who to contact to redirect funds. Without doubt, the insider component. I was talking with Trooper Johnson just before this event started, and it's interesting. They're actually created platforms to financially incentivize employees to deploy things that they would actually get compensated for if they were to pay out. So it's getting, they're making it very easy for things like that to occur, and it's pretty nasty when it does. But just want to mirror and what you shared.
Yeah, and I would add, beyond the financial component is the intellectual property. So, an intrusion into a network system, you're into the secret sauce, you're into the, the things that are the foundation of your business, and so it can cripple a business.
Of those identified threats, are there any particular techniques or threats that you consider the most dangerous to businesses?
So when I think about that, I think about three things. One is phishing, one is business email compromise, and the other is ransomware. And I say phishing just because it is the volume-wise, it reaches the most people. I think it is so heavily used, and it can reach anyone. Anyone can be a victim of it and compromise a company or start the process, allow access, enable access. Business email compromise, because it involves often manipulating the system. Once you're in, manipulating the system for usually for fraud to get into the payment system is a common scheme. And then thirdly, the ransomware, because again, it can do a lot of things. As we talked earlier in the week, it can, mask some things, and it can lock your systems down and, cost you money because you're not doing business, and hold you hostage, essentially.
Do you feel, and this question is really just a temperature check from the panel, anybody's welcome to chime in, but do you feel like the risk of these cyber attacks on businesses containing confidential or sensitive information, is that a growing risk? Is it something where it seems to be getting worse rather than getting better?
Yes, it's growing. I think we're hearing more about it. And there's different reasons for it. Some of it's money. Some of it is to sell the information on the dark web. And some of it is for brand damage. So it really, yes, it's growing. It's continuing, certainly, probably is growing. But it is really sensitive information, right? What is somebody holding? Personally identifying information, health information, that type of data is what you typically hear has been taken when there is a breach, an actual breach, and that you have to have more than 500 pieces of that information, right, to call it a breach. So yes, I think it is continuing, it is growing, and the question is for what reasons going forward.
We're seeing an exponential increase in security incidents across our client base. There's, with COVID and the work from home initiative, being behind a corporate firewall it offers a significant amount of protection, and that was completely disbanded. Everyone now working from home and trying to figure out how to function in that capacity without the, necessary security tools. A lot of organizations just, sent their employees out and work from their home computers, accessing corporate data just as stopgap measures, especially when local governments enforced, you can't work from your corporate office anymore. So seeing those situations occur, it just really opened it up. And also, I think there's a component with work from home where, that diligence level isn't necessarily there. You got the dogs barking behind you and the kids running around, and, you get that phishing email and don't quite stop long enough to check to make sure it wasn't, from Charlie directly asking for the gift cards, and they just do it. So I think all those play into it. The value of Bitcoin and anonymous currencies are making it that the proliferation, the ability for them to pay and just get money in such an easy way. And then obviously we're all seeing this in the news more and more with cybersecurity events happening from foreign government backed organizations, and then that no one's really being held accountable there. So it's just easy. No one's getting arrested overseas, and obviously you guys could speak more to that, but that's my perception of what we're seeing.
We're seeing the insurance premiums go up because the insurance companies are paying out more claims. So there's definitely a lot of activity. The criminals are so smart. And I was reading an article that said they had taken the data and held it for ransom, and they had a 1-800 number for the client to call to get the instructions on where to wire the money and the Bitcoin. And so they set up the 1-800 number, and it's real. It's a 1-800 number they're calling. And then, you call it a week later, and of course you can't get through to the number, but they're sophisticated and they are smart. And once they figure one out, they're getting in all these municipalities. The cyber insurance for the municipalities are getting so expensive because they just don't have the software to prevent some of these hackers from getting in. And so they're very sophisticated.
I also think that some people, network intrusion is important to keep an eye out for, is that your system might be a springboard for something else. You look at I think that was Target breach. It was the HVAC company that was the ultimate entry point into Target. So, sometimes you got to think outside the box. Well, it's not going to happen to me because I'm little this company here. But if you have access to another company, that may be why you're going to be targeted. And being a smaller company, you could be an easier target. So obviously, with your major corporations, they can put some money behind their security systems where the smaller companies can't. So, just because you don't think you necessarily can be a target, that's the wrong mindset and could cost a lot in the future. I've seen cases where, your remote desktop protocol credentials are for sale. So you can go on a dark website and purchase whatever company you want. So, this information is definitely out there, and you may not know that you've been compromised. So, you just got to keep an eye out for it.
Yeah, Charlie, I agree with everyone up here. I do think it's an increasing threat, and I think it's an increasingly visible threat. And I think that you see that reflected in the regulatory legal side with an emphasis, particularly at the federal level, on focusing on the companies themselves, whereas it used to be companies are victims, and from a regulatory legal perspective, we're going to help them out. There's still that, but on top of that, there's responsibilities, and increasingly so. And you see that even with Department of Treasury in October of last year, I believe, issued an advisory about the Office of Foreign Asset Control. Will be cracking down on the payment by companies of ransoms. all of that increasing scrutiny and increasingly diligent response by the regulators, I think reflects the environment and the increasingly difficult atmosphere companies are operating under.
Can I say one more thing? I'm sorry, not to belate the question, but just to give perspective around the amplification of this, that I'm in a CEO peer group of multiple IT business owners nationally, and we're all freaking out over this. I mean, so if your IT providers are, I mean, there's a lot that's being done and has been done to mitigate the risk as best we can, but it kind of feels like in a lot of situations we're bringing a knife to a gunfight, from a budgetary perspective, and we're not dealing with, there's always this iconic image of the hacker in the hoodie sitting in the basement. These are sophisticated organizations, toll-free numbers. The things that we see where they're leveraging automation, they're scripting. I mean, once they get in there, they know, typically with the technology as it's improving around detection, that their window is getting short. Now it's 11 days on average, when it used to be over 400 10 years ago, before they, potentially would deploy ransomware or be detected. And in those situations, I mean, they're getting in there very quickly. There's, in some cases, international teams of hackers that are working together to leverage that short window of opportunity to, get maximum financial benefit and do maximum damage during that time frame. So, yeah, this is a world we find ourselves in right now.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder if what good could be created if we took that sophistication and channeled it for proper purpose. I mean, it's the conversation I regularly have with my elementary school kid who has very elaborate ways of sneaking sweets. And it's like, dude, let's channel this energy for good here. There's got to be a better purpose for this. But Doug, you touched on a topic, and I wanted to follow up with it, which is the avenues. There's a lot of different avenues for hackers to get in, for these cyber criminals to get in. One of the vogue ways to do that is through the IT providers. So what does a good IT provider like your company do to set themselves apart in that regard and make sure that they're an asset to the companies that they service and not a liability?
Great question, tough question. And the reason I say that is that there was an incident just over July 4th weekend this year where the tools that my company fortunately didn't leverage it, but companies like mine that leverage to manage all the computers that we support, a company out of Miami called Kaseya, that product had a vulnerability in it. And the hackers, this is actually out of Russia, were able to leverage that tool to then deploy ransomware to all of these IT companies' computers, all their clients' computers, I'm sorry. So this was actually one of the largest ransomware events that occurred to date at that point. Didn't make much news. It was kind of crazy. It was about 1,500 companies that were impacted across 30 countries, because it's an international business, and didn't make much news because it didn't really affect, I think, the day-to-day like the Colonial Pipeline did, or people perceived that it would. But in that case, it was interesting. One of the companies in my CEO peer group just got their insurance renewal. You can imagine the policies that we have to carry to then protect us, and if a situation like that occurred. There's a lot of companies pulling out of the market that even will supply policies to companies like mine, and the policies are exponentially going up. But they actually put a disclaimer in saying that if you leverage Kaseya, they will not, renew your insurance. You'd have to get off the platform by the renewal. So with that, there's a lot. I'll dive into this, I'm sure, later. But for us, it's about layers. It's about process. It's about policies to really, protect even our clients from the tools that we have in place. Like we have, what's called zero trust platforms that we have tuned in to the point that the tools that we're using to manage our client environments, that new things can't run unless we pre-approve them from running. So if someone actually gets into that platform and tries to execute potential malicious script, but it's a moving target. I mean, so that's where it is today. But 6 months from now, 3 months from now, next week, it could be a different challenge. So we're constantly having to navigate that and keep up with it. But yeah, it's interesting. If and when a breach occurs, there's one of the questions we always ask when we're meeting with a prospective client is like, did you find out how it happened? And a lot of times the answer is no. And we say, did you look at the provider that you're working with, because it could have been a tools compromise there. And so these are questions that need to be asked during the process to find out what are you doing to mitigate our risk from even working with you? And that's really in general, and that's why, like the Department of Defense is the CMMC, which some of you may have heard, the cyber maturity model of if you do business with the DoD, you have to adhere to, this is now coming out as compliance requirements, but they're recognizing risk in their supply chain as potentially affecting them directly. So it's the same thing with your IT provider and your corporation, but there's a lot that goes into answering that. I could probably spend 2 days just talking about it. But I mean, a lot of it comes down to policy process and layers of mitigation, to protect against other, every tool presents a risk, and how you mitigate that with another tool potentially or process.
That zero trust policy seems very familiar to some of my litigious clients. Trooper, I just wanted to punctuate this part of the conversation. I wasn't clear, from your perspective, or I don't know if you have data or anything like that, or just if it's just a gut. Are there more criminal cases that you're finding? Criminal cases, your volume is increasing?
It is. I think some people are getting more emboldened by being able to sit behind a computer. I've actually seen more of an increase domestically versus, your foreign actors. The domestic is more on a smaller scale. Usually it's like one system here and there kind of deal, versus your foreign actors that go for larger targets. So that's kind of where we're at.
Wanted to pivot the conversation, and I'll direct this to Lynne, but anybody's welcome to chime in. Lynne, for those who might be in our audience or tuning in via the streaming platform, the average executive, I suspect we've got a good following of folks who might be whether it's a compliance personnel or whether it's IT related folks, but there are executives out there who I know who are here or who are interested in this topic. What would you say to them about, and what's the answer to the question, if you're speaking to an executive, why should I care about the minutia of cybersecurity threats or ransomware attacks? Why is that something I'm going to spend my executive level time to drag myself into the weeds on?
So cybersecurity used to be a peripheral and industry specific and largely IT department concern. That's no longer the case. Cybersecurity is now a core business risk and core business concern across industries with regulatory, contractual, and third-party implications. Every CEO should have on their list the taking of reasonable preventative measures as a necessary operational business consideration.
One of the things that I always say is, as an executive, you really are setting the strategy and the tone, and security in general of your organization, and especially your information and your secret sauce and your systems, is everybody's business. It really is everybody's responsibility in the company. And so if a CEO and his leadership team are serious about it, make it a part of the overall strategy, and it's important to them, by trickle-down effect, it will be important to everyone else.
I'm going to kind of follow. Thank you. I couldn't agree more. It's a required leadership piece at this juncture. Yeah, and kind of piggybacking on that, Lynne, on the back end of it, failure to be attentive to it from a leadership perspective very well may be a breach of your own fiduciary duties to the company, because the wrong type of incident finds you in a situation where the company's entire viability is at stake. I mean, I think Vicky had cited a statistic of 60% of the businesses don't survive. Well, if you don't have policies and procedures, if you don't have an incident plan, who's breached their fiduciary duties to the shareholders at that point in time? So executives have to pay attention to this type of issue, because it could very well import personal liability. I would kind of pivot the conversation to, I guess I can direct this to either Doug or Vicky as you feel fit. But if you're slightly informed yet conscientious executive who is looking to ascertain what's my company doing to be attentive to this issue, whether it's a question you might ask of the IT staff or the vendor, or whether it's the compliance or risk management side that handles insurance. What are the type of questions? How does that conversation start from an executive standpoint to their staff or to their vendors? I guess I'll pass it to Doug.
Okay. No, I think that's a great question. You know, being an old school IT guy, a lot of times my mind goes to tools and, like, you know, asking the questions of what systems do we have in place to prevent, you know, these things from occurring. But as Stephen in the audience, you know, being the having all the credentials associated with what I'm sharing with you, you know, he would share that it starts with policy. It starts with identifying, you know, what truly are you trying to protect. Stephen is saying you don't spend $100 to protect a $5 bill. So I think it begins with a conversation of identifying, you know, what potential fallout from a compliance perspective could there be? What does this look like? And opening the discussion of, you know, what, you know, again, not if, but when this happens, what's the potential fallout? How are we, you know, how can we mitigate the risk or the opportunity? So a lot of times, you know, it's a spray approach today where, you know, they're looking for that link to be clicked and then they get in, and it's just that those mass phishing emails that we all get, you know, weekly at this point or more frequently. And so how do you protect from that, like a not targeted situation? If we were more targeted, you know, depending on your organization, what are we doing to mitigate that risk as well? But then also what's the recovery and the response plan look like? So I think just opening that dialogue. I think first internally, to really identify from a business perspective, like what does this look like? You know, looking at events that I've seen occur across the IT companies that we, you know, have conversations with. You know, I've seen situations where companies have been completely inoperable for a month, you know, for an entire month, you know, for weeks at a time at a minimum before gaining core functionality, because it's not, you know, immediately going into recovery mode. There's a forensics activity that has to occur. You have to figure out what happened, potentially how they get in, because you're not just going to restore and then have the event occur again, right? So disaster recovery should not be confused with incident response. They're two different things. So, you know, it's those conversations I think have to take place preemptively to then, you know, form, you know, at least identify what's important to them, what needs to be protected, and then technology should then foster, you know, that protection, right? So those things and policies and things of that sort get defined. The technology then comes in after the fact. Again, being old school IT, I always went in with the technology first, but realizing, you know, this is a much larger conversation that needs to be had.
Yeah, there's a lot of training issues with employees that are part of these situations that happen. And I'm thinking about some of our clients that have had situations over the years. We got a call from a client. They had drop shipped $200,000 worth of computers, hardware and software, and found out after the fact that somebody had changed the address where the computers are going to be shipped to. And this place that they were shipped to is like, there's nothing there. So if somebody had them shipped there, picked them up, and they're gone, $200,000 worth of computers. So we had to turn it in as a claim. And, you know, could it be cyber? Could it be, you know, just theft? Is it a covered cause of loss? There's so many different things that come into play. But it's not just, we had an insurance company very recently, a workers' comp insurance company was refunding money to a client of ours, a business owner, and we were following up, where's the money? They said, we sent the money. Well, the check's been cashed. Well, guess what? Some employee went in and changed the address of the company, and it happened to be that there was two very similar named companies that were both insured by the same workers' comp insurance company. And, you know, somebody changed the address. So the check that was supposed to go to my client went to a different insured of that company, but it was $14,000. So of course that other company cashed it thinking it's their money and it was all honest on their part, but will the insurance company be able to get it back from them or not? You know, it's hard to say. So there's so many mistakes and people are short staffed and they're hiring people, and you got butts in seats that aren't thinking straight, don't have the education or experience, and they're pushing the wrong button on the computer. It's just like a whole storm of craziness.
I wanted to focus our conversation a little bit more on the ransomware component, just so we can speak to specifics about that for a moment. So I wanted to see the mic to Doug, and if anybody else has to further qualify Doug's statement on this. But Doug, give us an idea, to kind of set the table for us on what a ransomware attack really is, and to how it works, and really maybe why businesses need to be aware of this acute threat that we're going to discuss.
So just to define what ransomware is at a high level, it's basically malicious software that bad actors will execute in an environment that will encrypt the data in the environment, and then request some form of payment, typically Bitcoin, to potentially decrypt the data. This is they had to gain access to the environment in order to deploy that, or it could be a potential insider act, like we shared earlier. So these things, there's an evolution that's occurring around how these things actually begin, right? The phishing email, vulnerabilities in the platform's unpatched systems. There's a concept called a zero-day vulnerability, which is basically a vulnerability of a platform that there's no known patch for yet. Like, it just was announced this morning. It's already been, in the wild and being taken advantage of, and the vendors are quickly trying to catch up. This just recently happened with Fortinet firewalls, as an example, where VPN, they were able to actually connect to the network and then laterally move across the devices. So these are things. I mean, again, I keep saying not if but when, because you have this device sitting there. You don't even know it's an exposure point. You think you have a firewall and you're protecting your network, but really, because there's now a vulnerability of that system. So that's how they get in at that point, gaining access and then deploying. But typically they're deploying ransomware after they've already potentially explored the environment for other potential worth, and that's collecting information that could be sold on the dark web, or potentially collecting intellectual property that could be used to value, especially in foreign government situations where they're collecting that for to be more competitive, in their government against the United States potentially. So there's so I guess I define what ransomware was. It's interesting and seeing insurance claims and hearing things across the industry that when the insurance providers get involved, they're looking at who the bad actors are, and a lot of them are known at this point, and they actually have playbooks, or run books they call them, of like how they execute their, when they deploy their tools, how they interact, what the timelines are, things of that sort. So it's interesting where this the insurance providers, and you know better than me, but will know, like, based on who the bad actor is, what they're typically, whether or not, even if you pay the ransom, if they're going to give a key that works, and what the odds are of that, because that's not always a given. Also, if there's a component they've layered on. It used to be where if you had good backups, you were okay, right? So backups are not enough. I'm here to tell you that right now. Where you'd basically have the event occur, you'd restore from backups, and you were fine. What the bad actors have done is now they've introduced what's called exfiltration. They're basically copying that data offsite first, in a very short period of time, and that's sensitive information. And then this was Travelex. This was an example of a large corporation that this happened, where they basically will publish like a snippet of it on the web and say, hey, if you don't pay us, not only will you not get your data back, but we're going to actually put more on the web. And depending on the type of industry you're in, you could have compliance, issues, PCI, HIPAA, things that for healthcare. So there's fines that can, hugely outweigh even what the ransom is. So, it seemed like, from my experience, the default behavior for the insurance providers is pay, but then depending on who the bad actor is, they may know that they're just going to put the stuff out there anyway, and it's just a mitigation. How to mitigate it the best they can at that point. So no, I went all over the place on your question, but did I get to the heart of it?
You did. You nailed it.
Okay, good.
I would just add to that I think what's scary about ransomware and several other malicious actors is that they can either be a very organized and structured gang and very sophisticated, or they can be ad hoc and taking, from the Cliff Notes version, right, of old malware and implementing it. So you have the spectrum. It doesn't have to be, it's not a group of people sitting in an office saying, all right, here's how we're going to build this. It could be people out on the internet that are loosely affiliated saying, I need to find somebody who knows has this skill and this tool. And so they organize very loosely, but it's very effective in that environment.
One thing.
And just to make everyone aware of, there's this concept. I saw Trooper Johnson about this earlier, and there's this concept of what's called ransomware as a service, where basically the bad actors have actually formed a platform that you can subscribe to. They've created a monthly recurring revenue model for their business, and you just upload email addresses, and you could buy freely. You could even get for free from different websites, and they'll actually email out these phishing emails, and it looks like the dashboard of this thing. They have like KPIs. They're tracking how many emails were sent, how many files were encrypted, how much Bitcoin you've collected, and they take a fee. There's even an icon on the left side of the dashboard for get support, and depending on your level of what you pay them or percentage you'll give back to them, you have different SLAs for response. I mean, it's pretty crazy. So this is not new, unfortunately. So that's just kind of fostering that amplification that's happening. So they're making it that even not even sophisticated. You don't need to know programming anymore. You just subscribe, do it in a secure way through the dark web, and then leverage these systems. It's pretty scary.
And I think because of that, the domestic in-house insider threat is growing significantly because it's making it easier for anybody.
The ransomware layaway program. That's very kind of them. Toni, who's a target for ransomware attacks from your experience? And are there certain businesses or industries that are more prevalently targeted than others?
Well, that's a tough question. I think anybody's a target. I mean, but it's really cyber criminals are opportunists. At the heart of it, it's about money and power and money, right? Or power and greed. So I think the bigger companies that have a lot of money are certainly a target. And sensitive information. It just depends on what they're looking for. From my perspective, that's it. Yeah, that's my perspective.
I think it kind of falls into a couple different categories of bad actors. You have your ones that are, nation state backed, whatever the case may be. They go for high value targets. Then you get, your next rung down. They'll go for someone that has some security in place. You just kind of work your way down to where you get some has no clue what they're doing, and just getting lucky with someone that has absolutely nothing. And they'll learn and kind of work their way up. But I think there's different levels, varying levels, some being curious to malicious intent.
Trooper, is there any type of profile that law enforcement has worked up for the typical cyber bandit?
Not really, because it literally is all over the place. One of the network intrusion ones, there was actually video of him doing his intrusion, and he just put down his meth pipe. So literally, you don't have to, it's not someone that's got a PhD that's sitting behind a computer somewhere. It can be anybody. And in some foreign countries, they'll pull kids off the street 10 years old and start teaching them programming. So from 10 years on, all they know is programming and targeting systems and whatever the case may be, because that's how they're making money. If you're in a poor country and you can make decent money, working for someone programming, malware or ransomware, that's got a lot of incentive to it.
Before we move to the next topic, which is really prevention of ransomware or cyber crimes, is there any questions that we either have from our audience or from our online, Nikos? Okay, great. So I wanted to direct this. Let's talk about the insurance piece now, and I wanted to direct this question to Vicky. What type of coverages might exist to address these threats that we've talked about today, whether it's through cyber crimes like ransomware or some type of cyber extortion? Talk to us about the insurance coverages that might be available.
These insurance policies are very broad, and you can buy a very broad policy that covers your risk of liability to third parties. So for example, if you have a database with client information or patient information or your customer's credit card information, if you have those databases and somebody hacks in and steals the information, you have to have their credit monitored. If they want to have their credit monitored, you have to notify them. So that is like a third party coverage to protect you if your customers' data is out there, and they can sue you. So they can sue you because you let their data get out there. So that's a third party coverage also. If you have a big incident happen with a cyber problem at your company, the insurance company basically sends in a team to work on your computers. They help you with the crisis management and the public relations part of it, putting the word out in the world that, you know, you've been hacked and here's what you're doing to prevent it from happening again. You can lose business income because of a hack or have to recreate data. Those are first party coverages. Those are you losing money, and you can cover that lost business income. There's typically waiting periods or deductibles, but you can also, let's say they're trying to scrub your computers and your servers and everything to try to make sure there's no other infiltration into your system that's still there from the attack. Sometimes they don't feel comfortable that your systems are all okay, so you have to go and replace all your systems. So something like that can be covered under the insurance policy. And, you know, just working on the ransom, a lot of these policies cover the ransom. A lot of these policies cover the fines that you're going to get for the data getting out in the environment that you were supposed to have secured, the PCI fines. Years ago, there was a terrible cyber attack for P.F. Chang's restaurant, and the cyber liability policy paid for all the problems that came from the cyber attack, but they did not have coverage for PCI fines, and that was over $1 million that they were being fined for the information getting out there. So oftentimes it's an employee that made a mistake or left something open for somebody to be able to sit down and get on the computer and hack into it, or they didn't change their password like they should have. Now we're seeing too, the insurance companies, if you have a high risk situation, they're asking, are you using two-factor identification, where now they're going to send you a text to confirm that this is indeed you logging in, or they're going to send you an email to make sure it's you. And then you go and give the code. If you're saying to the insurance company that you are doing two-factor identification, and then there's a claim that happens and you maybe didn't do it, or you weren't doing it for that and you didn't realize it when you answered the question on the application, you know, some of these insurance companies are making decisions about whether or not they want to write your cyber liability policy based on the questions that you're answering on the applications and things like that. So be careful answering the questions, have your IT, you know, team really look at it and answer them. And if you're not sure, don't answer it, but you're not sure, or, you know, we think we're doing it right this way, or because they're really looking carefully. And there's some companies that the insurance company says, we're not willing to quote that risk at all. We already know it's a huge, you know, it's waiting to be hacked, and we're not going to get in there. So sometimes, you know, they're in it to make money also. So if they're not willing to write your insurance, you know, maybe it's time to really pull in some good specialists to get you protected, and then you might be able to get the insurance in place once you have the protections in place too.
So Vicky, if it's not an imposition, I'll go through a quick lightning round with you of, you let me know yes or no whether these are the type of things that there is coverage out there in the marketplace for. So yes or no, monies to pay demands from ransomware attackers. Is there coverage for that?
Yes. Not every single, what I'll say is, in general, you can buy coverage for these things, and some policies have them and some policies don't have them. For example, if you have a small property and general liability policy and you have a cyber coverage endorsement added to that policy, a lot of times that's more like third party. So you have protection if your third parties are coming against you and suing you, but you may or may not have coverage to pay the ransom, for example. So there's different coverages built into policies, and usually the standalone policy for cyber liability where it's just cyber, usually that's the broadest, and there's still differences in the different companies. If you have a quote from 4 different insurance companies, they're not standard coverage forms. They're going to differ, sometimes a little bit, sometimes a lot. And so you want an agent to go through a couple different options with you and explain, for this extra $500 a year, you could have a higher limit for this particular coverage. Or for an extra $1,000 a year, we'll go back and correct things. We'll cover things. You're buying coverage today forward, but something might have happened in the past that you don't even know about yet. And we'll go back and cover you to 5 years ago when you started your business. So there's different options available. And make sure that you're asking, are there other options? Or here's one of my concerns. Would something like this be covered? And
so knowing that each policy is negotiable and there might be different options, want to go through a couple of options that might be considered. So would, for instance, something like the cost of hiring experts to negotiate with hackers, is that something that could be a covered peril if
Yes.
negotiated? And then how about the cost of bringing in a computer forensics expert to understand how the hackers gained access or otherwise prevent future incursions? Is that a coverage that's available?
yes.
And then how about the cost of data loss or destruction, whether it be well, let me parse it out. Data loss or destruction for restorative measures.
Yes.
What about data loss or destruction, some consequential damages that may occur?
Yes.
How about loss or liabilities to third parties as a result of the data breach?
Yes.
And then how about some type of coverage for regulatory compliance after an attack? Case in point being, like, if a regulator says you didn't have the requisite measures, you've got to have X, Y, and Z. You see this a lot in financial services. Would that be a coverage that would be available?
Yes, more and more of these insurance policies for cyber are covering fines and things like that. Now, typically, insurance companies don't like to cover things like that because they're usually involving illegal acts. And the insurance companies don't typically like to cover illegal acts. But in the case of PCI fines and things like that, more and more insurance companies are covering them. Now, if you just have a little basic endorsement on your package policy, for example, you might have $1 million coverage if somebody comes after you, a third party, but the coverage for PCI fines might be a sublimit of $250,000 or something like that. But really take a look at some options when you're looking at this coverage. And it's a coverage that you should, especially if you have any kind of serious, your business could go under because of a hacker getting in, really take a look at this annually with your insurance agent and go over the options. And some of them you can buy it for a little more money, and just take a look at that and see if it's something you want to do. One of the things I recommend, I very rarely ever see it worth anybody taking on a higher deductible. That usually the premium savings is so minuscule and the difference in the deductible is so significant. So you can ask, if I took on a $10,000 deductible, would I save some money? And they'll go, yeah, $200 a year for, an extra $10,000 out of your pocket. So keep in mind that you can also have more than one attack, and then that deductible is going to be for each attack and things like that.
You raise a good question, or a good point on that, and I would be interested in Trooper and Toni's perspective regarding multiple attacks. Is that something that you see prevalently, where companies hit 1 month, and then in a short period of time, they're hit again?
It definitely can happen. As we've kind of pointed out with, if you restore from a backup that hasn't been verified to be clean, there could have been a backdoor already installed. That's kind of one of the issues with network intrusions is you don't always know when it actually happened. So, if you had your business before you had anybody come in, service, backdoor could have been put in then. You did a routine backup. It's now that backdoor that the perpetrator has is now on your backups. So you have to be extremely careful on which backups you use, the methodology, all that kind of stuff goes into play on whether or not you're actually safe. I mean, they'll come back and check, especially if there's no ransomware that has been deployed, they'll come back. Especially, if you have a business that has a high volume, let's say you're running processing credit cards. It's not encrypted or whatever the case may be, there could be incentive for them to come back. So it just depends on the volume of information that goes through your system.
I can say this without breaching any client confidences, but in 2015, I had a client come to me, which is a very reputable company in North Florida. If I said their name, everybody would know who they were, had been hit, finally came to me for incident response 4 times in 3 months. And it was debilitating each time, system crippling. Thankfully, we got some measures in place, and best of my knowledge, they're okay since then. But yeah, it happens a lot and in frequent and short order. Last question, I wanted to redirect it back to Vicky on the insurance piece. I just have not seen this written into coverages, but I've always been curious about it. Is it a covered peril, or is there product out there that can be negotiated to pay the cost of a PR agency in assisting with the communications part of an incident response and dealing with the crisis? Is that something that the insurers are picking up?
Yes. A lot of the insurance companies are picking up the public relations piece of how to mitigate your reputation after a hacker gets in. Some of the other coverages that are on some of these policies, you might not, like, for example, at my insurance agency, our agency software system is purchased and we pay a monthly user fee, and they keep all of our data. It's all in the cloud. And if they were to get hacked, I could lose a lot of money. So there's contingent business income coverage from somebody that you're using their services and they got hacked and it's affecting you and your business running. Whenever the storms come blowing into Florida, all the insurance companies close down. We cannot put policies in place when there's a storm heading our direction. So one of the homeowners insurance companies, for example, they won't write a new homeowner's policy for sometimes it's 2 or 3 days that the storm's coming. And then before it moves out, there's 2 or 3 days that we can't even write a policy. We can't even quote it. So, I mean, you'd think that we could go in and quote for 3 days and have 25 quotes sitting there waiting to sell once the storm passes. We can't even quote it. So it's kind of like a loss of business income. We're not going to have insurance for it or anything like that. But if somebody you're using their computer systems gets hacked and you can't get in the systems to do what you need to do, I mean, computers are controlling everything. They're controlling temperatures. So you could have things in a freezer or refrigeration system. That system shuts down because the computers were hacked. There's so many different things that, the insurance may or may not cover things like this, but a cyber liability policy looking at specific risks that you have. I mean, even electricity could be turned off by a hacker and you don't have electricity. Are you going to have coverage if you don't have the internet? If you can't get on the internet, you can't do business, but it might not have anything to do with you or a hacker at your location. So you can buy some contingent business income coverage and things like that.
So before we pivot to the surviving and recovering from an attack, I kind of wanted to ask a wrap-up question, and we'll start with Lynne. And what I'd like to do is subsequently pass the mic down through the panel. Hopefully, it'll be a compounding discussion. But from your perspective, each of the panelists brings a certain angle to the panel and to the discussion. Tell me about the principles and required measures for a sensible approach to ransomware or cybercrime prevention from your perspective. And hopefully, as our audience consumes these answers, you'll be able to understand each respective perspective, where Lynne might be speaking to legal issues and Trooper Johnson be speaking to the law enforcement side, and Toni be speaking to a very diversified approach, which entails the people component of it, and we've got an insurance and an IT expert. And so the dynamics of each of them bring are really the four legs of the stool, and so to speak, as to putting together a prevention program. So kick us off on that discussion, please, Lynne.
Sure, and I think we'll get into a little bit more detail about the legal and regulatory framework maybe later in the discussion. But generally, I think from a legal perspective, the principle is to have, particularly at the management level, because as I think Toni pointed out earlier, it really does start there and then trickle down throughout the entire organization. But to have an understanding of where your risk exposure is and know that it is multi-layered. So there's a regulatory risk on the front end and the back end for every business, regardless of industry, and even more in certain industries. There is a contractual risk that every business, again, likely faces, particularly nowadays. You look at your most basic contract, most basic vendor contract, they're going to have some level of requirement with respect to cybersecurity and data privacy. So if you're not aware that your contracts, or a vast majority of your contracts that you have already entered into, have this risk presented, there's no way to properly calculate how to address it or to understand, what you're facing and what measures might be needed down the line. Every contract nowadays should be reviewed for not only your more traditional risks and liabilities, but what your responsibilities are with respect to cybersecurity and what your vendor's responsibilities are with respect to cybersecurity. There's also, as Vicky talked about, third-party risk, and third-party risk can be very significant. And again, somewhat industry specific, but it can be significant to the point where you need to have mapped out different third parties who could possibly be impacted, either secondarily or tertiarily or directly by a cybersecurity threat that your company faces. So as a principle, again, you need to have an organizational and managerial plan in place to understand risks, prioritize risks, and then see how they equate to what you need to do from a preventative perspective. Because as someone mentioned earlier, it is all about risk, reward, cost, benefits, just like any other business decision, but it is a business decision. It does need to be factored in.
I think training can go a long way. Taking time to read your emails, make sure that, if you get any attachments, you're expecting them. It's just people need to slow down a little bit, especially with dealing with emails and financial transactions. I've got consulted on a case where basically 2 letters of a company's website were manipulated. So, they registered a whole website and everything with this new address, but at quick glance, it looks like a normal vendor email address. So they were able to secure funds that way because it looked like it came directly from, the CEO, CFO, whoever has authority to make payments. So we need to slow down a little bit, and if there is a ransomware attack, you need to make sure to include law enforcement in whatever your response plan is. We have the capabilities to do seizure of funds to subpoenas, search warrants, whatever the case may be. And we work directly hand in hand with any incident response company that comes out. So biggest thing is that, you know, it's not necessarily a matter if you're going to be a victim of ransomware, malware, network intrusion. It's just a matter of when. You may not know or expect to be. Like I said, you may not think you have anything of value, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you wouldn't be a victim, because you can be used as a method to obscure an investigation. So they can use your platform to attack another platform. When it comes to the network intrusion response, we're going to be looking at your company, and then we'll be looking somewhere else. So that's why I say, if someone's saying that it can't happen to me, it probably is going to, or already has, and you just don't know it yet. So you need to keep up on your training, follow through with any advice through any of the companies that you may hire for security concerns.
There was an article run by the Wall Street Journal, I think in early September, some of you may have seen, touching on the slowdown aspect. It was entitled something like cyber criminal's best friend is your brain. And it looked at the lizard response, the tendency for people to try to be efficient and respond to things quickly. And that, coupled with smart buildings and everything else we've talked about here, is essentially the recipe for success for cyber criminals. So slow down is a huge warning, and good advice.
So from my perspective, if we're getting ready for an incident, it's, cyber is one of many crisis incidents, and it really starts very strategically, again, at the top, and identifying what is important to you. Yes, you could be attacked. Anybody can be attacked, harm your business, cripple your business. But the idea is to strategically identify what is important to you and what needs to happen. What do you really need to protect to continue your business? And maybe that information is not connected to the internet. We have a huge reliance on the internet in this country, which is what makes us vulnerable. So consider, taking that real sensitive stuff off the internet, where there's nothing attached to the internet, which will obviously help your chances. But, you're taking more of a proactive approach than a reactive. Obviously, if you're hit, you're going to be reactive. That's just part of it. But in that proactive mode, the strategic planning, and within that strategic planning, as I said, separating, understanding what it is you're protecting, systems wise and information wise, because there's a lot of information in a lot of different forms throughout the company. So it's not just on systems, it's within your people as well. And so we're in the people business, and that brings up, again, the insider threat is an issue, and phishing being the most common used technique to target people. Penetration testing is an easy thing. For a while, people got real offended if they were pen tested and got phished, basically. But I'll tell you what, when it happens once, they remember. And I think it's very eye-opening. So something as simple as that is extremely effective. And again, I say it's everybody's business to help secure your information. And so that communication within the organization and outside the organization is so important. And I can tell you, in any crisis situation, there's the crisis, and then there's the crisis within the crisis, which is usually a communications issue. So having a structured, who's going to be notified, obviously decision makers that can execute the plan, that you actually have a thought out plan, and that you exercise that plan. Because if you haven't, nobody's going to know exactly what to do.
I think also, when you buy a cyber policy, you usually get access to a database that has a lot of information for you to be able to share with your employees and use for training and things like that. And then if you ever have anything happen to you or your company, call your insurance agent, even if you don't think you're buying cyber liability, and just find out if there's any of your policies that might respond. If you get any kind of a letter from an attorney ever, call your insurance agent. I'm so surprised sometimes how long it takes my clients to think to call me. And, you know, usually it's something that's covered and they're already nervous. And, you know, a lot of these insurance companies, if you have a good relationship with attorneys, they'll work with you and your attorneys, you know, that are familiar with your contracts and your way of doing business and things like that. So you can ask them to work with your attorneys and things like that. But just, I think you have to get the professionals to help you keep these people out of your systems and really make sure that you're doing things securely. What I see is small business owners are running their business and they don't have the time, or they don't take the time to get the computer people in to really look at where are we vulnerable and just get the answers that are needed to not have the hackers get in, because the time that it's going to take once they get in is 25 times what it would have taken to prevent it from happening in the first place. Even my agency, I mean, I think every single day I get 1 or 2 phishing emails. They say invoice attached. And I mean, I'm a bill payer. I'm not gonna, my bills don't get paid late. Somebody already figured that out because they're sending me invoice attached. I'm like, what invoice? And if I don't know the name of the company, I just delete it. I'm like, oh, that doesn't look right to me. I don't have a bill from that company, but I'm like, you know, what do you mean invoice attached? What do you mean late payment? I mean, they really trick you.
As I shared earlier, you know, security needs to be a multi-layered approach. You know, there's, I think, I know all of our clients and all of your businesses, you didn't go into business for any of this stuff, right? I mean, you're serving, you know, your clients, and you started with a passion and for what your organization does for your clients in the community. And, you know, but unfortunately, this has just become a cost of doing business, you know, and the cost continues to go up. You know, we're looking at it even ourselves, because I mentioned our cyber insurance policy for ourselves continues double year over year, you know, 4 years in a row now. And, you know, we have to start baking that into our cost of delivering service. It was never a factor before. It was just a SG&A expense. And now it's something that we have to actually factor into what we charge. So these are, you know, over the years, our security package has evolved significantly. Before, I mentioned earlier, backup, you know, it's not enough. Antivirus, and it used to be antivirus, firewall, and backup. Like, you had those 3, you were typically okay. You know, that's not the case anymore. I mean, hear me now. You know, there's much more sophisticated tools and things that need to be layered in place. You know, fortunately, the market is catching on, where the products that only existed really in the enterprise space before are now much more affordable and kind of packaged in a way for the small to medium-sized organization. So, you know, it's really, you have to maximize your security spend, right? Because one tool, potentially you can get 4 tools for the same spend, you know, so you have to look at that, you know, and there's gotchas and pros and cons of those situations. So like our security suite that we've developed has literally a dozen different layers to it. One of them being, you know, employee training with phishing simulation. So you're testing your staff on an ongoing basis, and everyone falls for the Southwest Airlines buy 1 ticket, get 1 free. I don't know what it is. Everyone wants 2 tickets for the price of 1, but they're willing to give away their credentials, your keys to the kingdom, to get that airplane ticket. So, you know, with those, but identifying that beforehand, seeing like who failed it. If you have someone that continuously fails it, then that's an HR conversation. But, you know, identifying those things ahead of time, you know, having the incident response plans. You know, it's not, you know, again, a dozen security products, you know, and layers around training and things of that sort. But then, you know, having those proactive conversations internally, having a program in place to proactively identify those risks and mitigate them. That's not a one-time assessment that you do. It has to be an ongoing program that exists in the organization that continuously drives feedback to the leadership team to take action on and identify those things. So it's an ever-moving target, unfortunately. So you have to have an ever-moving program to kind of foster the changes in the organization. But right now it's about layers. It's about, you know, identifying the gaps, mitigating the gaps best you can. You could spend all your profit on, you know, mitigating these things. Obviously, that's not realistic, but if you can make yourself enough of a challenge that they'll move on to the next opportunity that isn't as well protected, then at least do that, you know. So there's some, hopefully some good insight for you.
Well, I just peeked down at the time and it's getting near. I had probably 30 minutes to an hour of Frost Nixon, Tim Russert level type of dialogue prepared for us that I'm going to have to distill in only one question for the panel as to surviving an attack or resolving these type of issues. So what I'd like to do is replicate what we just did, start with Lynne, but I'd like to ask the question, what's one nugget or takeaway that you really need to bestow upon the audience as to what they need to do when they're attacked, both in dealing with it in the moment or subsequently resolving it?
So call your insurance agent and your lawyer. And your IT guys, although you should have already been in good touch with them. There is, and I was ready to launch into a very long and very boring spiel about all of the regulatory framework around here. But there are federal laws. There are federal laws that are industry specific. There are federal laws that are public company specific. There are very broad federal laws. Federal Trade Commission is sort of the primary agency. Become somewhat familiar with the federal regulatory landscape, and then become somewhat familiar with the state regulatory landscape. It does matter. Here in Florida, we have a pretty robust notification and reasonable preventative measures requirement for businesses under Florida law, as well as additional measures required under federal law. Become somewhat well versed with that. Just know what's out there. Know what's out there from a regulatory requirement standpoint. Become familiar with your contracts and the new contracts you're getting into. Know what they require and offer with respect to cybersecurity. Identify your third parties that you need to be aware of. Identify them and see what risks and what potential opportunities they offer. From a legal perspective, if you equip yourself with that knowledge and then you have professionals you can trust in the event you have questions about it, and then certainly in the event if you ever unfortunately have to deal with a situation like this, that's my takeaway and advice.
I would say mine is have a plan. Make sure you have a plan in place. You know, it doesn't have to necessarily be thorough or you know, extensive, but just have something in place so, you know, when you get that initial shock of, okay, this just happened, you know what your next move is going to be. You know, and to include contacting law enforcement. You know, if you have an incident response company, make sure that they're notified. They may already know, you know, if you have a managed system, but notifications need to be made and not be embarrassed to involve, like I said, law enforcement or anybody else for help. You know, if you don't have an IT department, you know, if you're a one-man shop, you know, then you can call, you know, the law enforcement, Secret Service, FBI. We can't do mitigation. We can't do that kind of stuff, but at least we can get the ball rolling and kind of point you in the right direction. Just, you know, and if you do have an incident response company, make sure that they'll work with law enforcement. I have a completely different view of what is going on than what they're going after. So that's just something to keep in mind. I've had cases where the incident response companies don't want to necessarily work with us, and it may be you know, a disclosure issue with the contract or something, you know, that they have that they feel that they can't, whatever the case may be. Just, you know, keep that in the back of your mind.
Yeah, I would echo what they've said. I think if I was still in the law enforcement shoes, I would say early on call law enforcement, because it gives law enforcement, you know, it builds the intelligence base basically, and they can identify if it's a similar group, where they're from, and maybe find attribution and actually get a prosecution, whether it's overseas or not, or whether it's here in this country. So the incident response groups, which I do some of that, you know, we're doing the same thing. We're going to image the computers. Law enforcement's going to image your computers. We're going to try to find where the incident, where it came in, what happened, where it came in. So there has to be a champion, if you will, of the project that will give access to the people. We have to understand how, you know, what happened within the company, what devices, and then move from there. But it is a good idea to contact both law enforcement and your incident response.
One of the things I was reading said, just put something between you and the criminals. If it's good, you know, software systems to protect you, the more you put in between, they're going for the easy hack, the easy passwords. And if it's getting difficult to get in your system, they're going to go find an easier one to get into. So just anything that you put between you and them is going to help.
I would share that there's a big difference I think everyone needs to recognize between an IT provider like myself that is on the defense side, prevention, I would say, versus incident response. There's companies that's all that they do, kind of waiting in the wings. So when you engage your insurance provider, I think that's the early first phone call when it seems like something is going on, because they could pull in, a team of experts that this is all that they do, right? We're managing more of the day-to-day. Incident response organizations that are pulled in by insurance providers, that's what they do. So that's when they, as far as putting things between, I mean, a lot of times the incident response team is really interjecting themselves even between us and the client as far as, what we're then doing as a next step, because I think a default response or reaction is recovery, but you actually don't go there. You go further down. That happens further down the line. You have to gather forensic information on what occurred, what systems were actually compromised. There was, even the backups and vetting them. That's why, this is not a quick recovery process. As I mentioned, backups are not enough, because in some situations and having conversations with other CEOs, just prepping for this, I mean, there was stories they were telling me where they had them spin the backups, which took days just to bring those up just for them to vet them. So they're not even recovering yet. They're spending days just bringing things up in an isolated environment offline just to see whether or not they were in there prior before even starting restoring everything. And then coming the determination, even once they couldn't decide whether or not they were in there or not, because they couldn't come to that determination, to saying we're just going to rebuild from scratch, and then you're beginning that process and then selectively vetting data. So, there's on the incident response side, having a plan, communication is key internally and externally. You don't want employees sharing information that could potentially damage the reputation of the organization, controlling the messaging that's happening externally. So these are all things that are identified in that simulation. So there's a component of incident response plan, and there's another which is called the tabletop exercise, which is really you then act as if it's occurred. And then getting in, after a holiday weekend, 4-day weekend after Thanksgiving, you walk in, you have this horrible message on your screens, then what? And then kind of acting it out, like who's doing what, who's controlling the communication, what calls are we making? Is the attorney that gets the call first, so things are under, client privilege at that point, or is it the insurance company? All these things I think need to be decided ahead of time, so you're not making decisions under duress. The IT companies are, they'll be there to support you through those things, but there's other experts as well that can get pulled in and things that could be decided well enough ahead of time.
I would be grossly derelicting my duties if I didn't ask the panel the first question that I always get asked by a client is, should I pay this or not? So what say you, panel? Should they pay or not? Take that one.
No, you got.
So having been a hostage negotiator, this is a kidnapping essentially. And I mean, I think the government, as it said, doesn't negotiate with kidnappers, and will give you that advice as well. But you're looking out for yourself at this point, and there has something to do with regulations, the legal aspect of it, the insurance aspect of it. How much can you pay? Part of that has to go into the planning. That aside, I will say this: some of the same techniques that are used in hostage negotiation are suitable in this scenario as well. And part of what you are doing is stalling for time. It's time to gather the money, maybe negotiating down a little bit. If you can pay less, wouldn't you want to pay less? And collecting information so that hopefully you can, attribute where this came from and pass the information on to law enforcement.
If you are considering payment, be aware that Department of Treasury and others are starting to really focus on cracking down on when those payments are impermissible. There are maybe fines imposed. It's an evolving area, but it is an area that's very much on the radar of federal law enforcement.
Technically I would say no, but I can't tell you, you have to do what's best for your business. And basically what you were saying, ultimately, that's why this keeps going on. In reality, if no one's paying, there's no reason for the ransomware. I mean, unfortunately, yeah, you could lose your, important information, and I understand that's why it's kind of you got to consult with your inner circle everything like that. But the reason behind everything is strictly about money. So if there's no more money, there's no more incentive.
I would just say, unfortunately, it's not a clean-cut answer, and that it depends, right? Every situation's unique. As I mentioned earlier, the insurance companies are really starting to know, which hackers will expose data if the ransom is not paid. So in those cases, they're quick to pay because of the fact that they don't want the associated potential compliance, claims that may ensue after that. There was a situation I was just talking with an organization, another IT provider, that they chose not to pay and just went to restore their systems. The hackers then actually did what's called a denial of service attack, which is sending a whole bunch of traffic to their internet connection at their office, basically making their internet connection not function. So they couldn't restore, over the internet to get the data back. And also it was a large, over $100 million manufacturing company. They couldn't, all their shipping information occurs over the internet. They couldn't ship. They had a full loading dock full of materials that couldn't go out the door because their internet connection wasn't working. So they basically said, hey, you're not going to pay us. That's fine. We're going to make it that you can't function as a business. They took down their website, did the same type of denial of service attack, to the point that the website provider, it not only brought down their website, it brought down the entire website provider and all of the associated sites that they were hosting. I mean, so these are, you think about the power that they have, that they can wield in doing things like this. So it's, it depends, right? And in that situation, they chose not to pay, and then they wound up actually having to pay, and they negotiated it from $500,000 to $100,000 just to get their internet connection back. And then they, right now left them alone, but it may come back. They can still publish things.
Thank you. I wanted to, before we conclude, I wanted to just give one last opportunity in the event that our audience or any of our folks online have questions. Nikos will have some housekeeping at the end. And of course, there's a complimentary lunch. So you're welcome to approach any of our panelists for further discussion. But there is a question? Yes, ma'am. Marcella, thank you for your question. Just to reframe and reiterate the question from the audience, it's, I suppose, in consumer-based transactions, is it safe for a business owner to attach the Square type of payment so that you can have quick transactions with customers? Did I get that right, Marcella? Anybody interested in fielding that question?
Thank you for the question. So unfortunately, I'm going to say there's risk in everything, right? So, looking at that specific situation, there's, Android and iPhone or iOS devices. Androids historically are more prone to viruses and such. And there was just actually a recent one that was pretty nasty as far as capturing all the information on the phone. So, and that was just within the last few weeks. So I would say iOS devices historically have been more secure, but still have security updates and patches that happen. Square as a company has a pretty big target on their back with all the financial transactions that they do. I would say, overall, that's just a way to do business, and it comes with associated risk. I mean, they're a third-party processor for your credit card transactions, so they're assuming some of your PCI compliance. You can probably address that more than me. But it's just, unfortunately, I would say if I was you, it's just a risk of doing business. But you just have to I would prefer personally to do that more on an iOS, like an iPhone versus an Android phone, if you're going to choose one or the other, just to kind of minimize that as best you could. But there's still risk in it, but it's just you could do it, but knowing that there's an opportunity there, but it's fairly minimized in Square and what the teams that they have to protect the data as well.
Thank you, Marcella. Nikos, as I understand, you've got a question from those tuning in via streaming.
Yes, a couple of questions from the virtual audience here. They're about social media as kind of a theme here. So they want to know, what does the panel think of malware bites? And then the second part of that is also about social media, such as the use of Facebook and LinkedIn.
Just to repeat the question, what does the panel think of malware bites as opposed to pretzel or bagel bites? And what are there any threats regarding using social media? Would anybody like to chime in and field those type of questions? Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
You could tell I'm a newly minted dad with all my dad jokes.
Just for malware bites, and I can let the panel address social media. That's basically to explain what it is. Understand the question correctly, is just a software tool for scanning or potentially preventing malware from being installed on a computer. So there's a free version which will do scanning, and there's a paid version which can do some real-time protection. All of these tools, have an opportunity to miss things, unfortunately. So that's where I was referring to layers earlier. Malware bites in combination with Defender in combination with other things. So it's just a tool. It does an okay job. There's other products that do okay jobs too. And it's really it's like just a bullet in the arsenal, but it's not a cure-all by any means.
Unfortunately, there's no 100% tool that works for every single thing, unfortunately. If someone tells you that, or you see that in advertising, stay away from it.
That's right.
I'll address the social media. I mean, social media, again, it's really a double-edged sword. It's done so many good things. It's keeping people connected and familiar, and at the same time, anybody who wants to exploit you or exploit your social media profile can certainly do that. And I go back to, just thinking about what is on social media. People check in where they are, talk about relatives, date of birth may be part of the profile, where you were born, where you went to school. Somebody can really wreak havoc with that information. So I'm also, I like to say be online, but be smart online.
Yes, we have time for one more question. Sure. Question was from a small business owner as to how do I determine how well I am doing in terms of assessing and preventing cybersecurity risk. And what was the latter component of that, ma'am? How well am I doing, and what was the other part? What are the steps she should be taking? Would anybody like to field that? Yeah.
Thank you for the question. I mean, I think that's on the minds of most small business owners, unfortunately. There's an organization called the National Institute of Standards Technology, or NIST. They've actually developed frameworks for auditing an environment against different standards that have been developed, and it's categorized in a way where, depending on the size of the organization, there's different things that are applicable. There's another one called CIS, or for the Center of Internet Security. That's what it is, and they've developed also like a top 20 questions that could be asked. So, that was my way of saying that there's frameworks to audit your environment against, and I would involve a third party, potentially not even your IT provider. The auditors shouldn't be auditing themselves. So to really look at that, NIST and CIS give a framework for them to measure your organization against, is based on your size and complexity, to say like what things should potentially be in place. So that kind of can give you a checklist, so to say, of potential gaps that could be identified that can minimize things. So I appreciate that you're PCI conscious, but the 10 to 15 employees, that's where the majority of your risk, I think, exists, and those computers are using every day, and whether or not the right things are in place to make it that misclick happens, that you're protected against something being deployed or information being collected.
Yeah, I would echo that. The government has published a lot for the public to consume. And I was thinking the same thing for you is, rules of behavior for your employees. Just start there, very basic, that they know, you're not supposed to go out on the internet on your own. You're not supposed to go on your social media while you're on my, particular systems.
Just very quickly, and obviously Vicky could speak to this comprehensively, but also, call your insurance provider, see what protections you have in place and what he or she might recommend in addition, because that'll give you an indication of where they think your risk is.
There you go. I,
Perfect.
I have, an additor to that in the sense that we compile this panel for a reason reflective of different perspectives. And so I serve as the general counsel I've served as the general counsel for companies in 20 or so different industries. And if I was asked that question from my client, the way that I would answer it is parsing out responsibilities. So to the extent that we have a lawyer here, I don't think Trooper Johnson's going to proactively vet your systems, but he's certainly a good guy to know on the back end. Toni's got, we've seen a lot of different diversity of perspective that she provides, but she's a service provider like her who's able to bring that experience to the table. We've got an insurance person, we've got an IT person. So I would tell my clients, to the extent that you have that cabinet of internal or external service providers, each one of those has different perspectives and a checklist that they're going to want to walk you through. And if you're a prudent executive, you're bringing all those collective voices together, and you're making sure each one of them has shored up their respective scopes of responsibility. And that's kind of what we, from my perspective, when I come in as a general counsel, providing legal advice to companies, not only am I talking to them about the legal aspect, I'm making sure they got the right team together. So hopefully that helps. We've got to land the plane here. We could keep going all day, but Nikos, what wrap-up items do we have to address?
We just want to thank everybody for attending, and we want to thank our panelists for joining us for the presentation today. We wanted to, echoing what Charlie said, we wanted to put together a panel that would represent all the different perspectives that are involved in a situation like this, because it's certainly on everyone's mind. So we appreciate your time. And for those who joined us online, we thank you for attending the presentation today. We are now going to move into the lunch and networking portion of the program for those that opted in for that. And we will be moving outside. So if you'd like to contact any of today's panelists and you're joining us online, you will simply, you can contact Jimerson Firm. We'll get you connected, 904-389-0050, or on our website at jimersonfirm.com.